Welcome to Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel, the Education and Program Coordinator at the Polk Home and Museum. Today's episode features Dr. Mark Cheathem. Dr. Cheathem is a professor at Cumberland University, an award-winning author of several books on the Jacksonian period, and the current co-editor and project director of the Papers of Martin Van Buren. His most recent book is The Coming of Democracy, Presidential Campaigning in the Age of Jackson.
So if you're not familiar, the 1840 election was the contest that was primarily between William Henry Harrison, who was the Whig Party nominee, and Martin Van Buren, who was the incumbent Democratic president. If you don't know anything about either one of these, which probably most of you may know more than I do, frankly.
We don't. In the early 19th century, there are two prominent political parties in the United States, the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs are the party of the great compromiser, Henry Clay. The Democrats stem from the ideology of Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. The Whigs are for a strong federal government, internal improvements, and encompass a wide range of political beliefs because the party is mostly united by one central tenet, opposing Jackson. The Jacksonian Democrats, on the other hand, champion the rights of the common man by expanding suffrage to all white men, opposing what they saw as the aristocracy and pursuing territorial expansion. Now, in 1840, Martin Van Buren, aka the Red Fox of Kinderhook, is the Democratic candidate. And William Henry Harrison, aka Old Tippecanoe, is the Whig.
Van Buren has a number of different nicknames, some of them nice, some of them we can't mention in this venue. But probably his most famous nickname is Old Kinderhook. And so he is there on the left. And then on the right, you have William Henry Harrison, who was a War of 1812 hero, had been a minister to a Latin American country, and then had retired, was a county clerk in the mid-1830s when the Whigs plucked him from obscurity, sort of, and asked him to run as one of three Whig candidates in 1836. Of course, the Whigs lost in 36 to Van Buren, but in 1840, or actually in December of 39, the Whigs prevailed upon Harrison to be the nominee, the sole nominee of the party in 1840. What I focused on in this book, again, is I looked primarily at the interaction of what we call formal politics or traditional politics, so things like actually casting a vote. Things like the congressional caucus, which is not something we have today when it comes to nominating presidents, but they had back then. So looking at that formalized presidential politicking and campaigning that took place in the Jacksonian period, and then comparing that and looking at the interaction of that with what we now would consider traditional campaigning in today's parlance or in today's terminology, but not necessarily at that time.
Now here, Dr. Cheathem goes on to explain how cultural politics influences the election of 1840 in many different ways. So what is cultural politics? Well, according to Professor Steph Newell, the term cultural politics refers to the way that culture, including people's attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and perspectives, as well as the media and arts, shapes society and political opinion, and gives rise to social, economic, and legal realities.
So one of the things that is encapsulated in cultural politics is public events and speeches. Something that we're very familiar with today. You know, every presidential candidate has to go press the flesh, has to have rallies, has to, meet the people and speak to the people. That was something that really came out of the Jacksonian period. The first time you have a presidential candidate who truly gives a campaign speech is in the 1836 campaign, and that was William Henry Harrison. By 1840, Harrison is giving dozens of speeches. That's really the emergence of that type of campaigning. And then public events, public rallies, again, have sort of been there in a nascent form during the Jacksonian period, the early Jacksonian period, but they arrived full formed in 1840. Public correspondence is another aspect of cultural politics. So this is where you have presidential candidates writing to constituents or writing to voters, and voters writing to candidates. And typically what would happen is you would have some interested voter who may or may not have had some ulterior motive, who would write to a presidential candidate and say, what are your views on the tariff? Or what are your views on slavery? What are your views on Texas annexation? And as a presidential candidate, you would feel obligated to reply to that, and to answer voters' questions. And you knew, as the presidential candidate, that your response was probably going to be published in a newspaper. And so you would craft your message knowing that it's going to be a public message. It's not just meant for this one person. And that is something that we don't really see today. I mean, if you write any politician today, you get a form letter back if you're lucky, maybe a form email. But in today's world, we have more immediate ways of contacting candidates, right? We have social media with Facebook and Twitter and that sort of thing. You have print culture, and so this is primarily newspapers. Newspapers at the time were not unbiased. They were very partisan. Political parties owned newspapers, and they were very transparent in the fact that they were for a candidate or for a party. Unlike today, right, where we say we're not biased as news organizations, but in reality, news organizations probably are in some way or another. And then you have, also as part of print culture, you have either biographies, sometimes autobiographies, but books or sometimes pamphlets that would be written about a candidate. Some of them were true, some of them were not. For example, Davy Crockett, you're all familiar with David Crockett. He allegedly wrote a biography of Martin Van Buren that was not very flattering during the 1836 campaign. Well, it turns out he actually didn't write it, but the Whig Party used Davy Crockett's name in order to try to disparage Martin Van Buren.
Dr. Cheathem highlights example after example of how the 1840 campaign introduced new political tactics. While some of these tactics now seem antiquated, like a character assassinating Martin Van Buren biography falsely attributed to David Crockett, these strategies were the roots for many of our contemporary political tactics. Today, each presidential election cycle sees bookstore shelves filled with biographies of the candidates penned by pundits and politicians. The 24-hour news cycle features competing partisan portrayals of the leading candidates, and the campaign trail is long and littered with public appearances and speeches.
You have political music, so songs that are used to rally the troops, so to speak, find a way to convey a message in a musical form that will stick with voters, that they can use at these rallies, that they can use at these public events. And then visual culture, which means in this case political cartoons. And so we'll spend the rest of our time looking at music and cartoons just to see how presidential candidates and campaigns were using these two forms of cultural politics to try to reach voters and try to rally support for their particular campaign. So in any case, political songs have been around since the very beginning of the United States, even before that. They usually were very positive. They usually were very celebratory at the beginning of the United States, which makes sense. You have a young nation, you're trying to create a culture, a positive culture. And then as we progress decade after decade, things start to go a little bit negative. And you start to see examples of songs that are not nearly as positive.
Dr. Cheathem did not have the luxury of playing any of these campaign songs for the crowd, so I decided to seek out some period musicians for a demonstration. Thankfully, President Polk Home and Museum docent Debbie Lewis and her husband Mark specialize in 19th century tunes, and they invited me for a personal performance in their living room.
Okay. Our names are Mark and Debbie Lewis. We perform historical music for various historic sites here in Columbia. A couple of songs that we're going to do today, The Promises of Clay and Save Texas, were popular political songs in the 1840s during the James K. Polk era. Frequently during that time, they took songs that were popular because people knew the tunes and they would add words to make them political songs for the campaign. And so these are a couple of examples of that. The Promises of Clay was written to the tune of Rosin the Bow, a popular folk tune of that time. And Save Texas was written to the tune of Old Dan Tucker, another popular folk tune. So we'll do those songs for you, and hopefully you'll enjoy them. The Whigs obtained power and station by thousands of promises made, deceived and defrauded the nation, and its best interests betrayed, and its best interests betrayed, and its best interests betrayed, deceived and defrauded the nation, and its best interests betrayed. 2 million they promised in 40, roast beef and $2 per day.
So in the 1840 campaign, if you don't know, the 1840 campaign has its own nickname. It's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign. And that is a description that comes from, ironically enough, the Democrats trying to represent Harrison as some old bogey who's just going to sit by his fireside in his log cabin and drink hard cider instead of doing the hard work of the American people. You know, who wants to elect a retiree? You know, it's crazy, right? And so the Democrats use this to criticize Harrison, and the Whigs take it and turn it around and say, well, why wouldn't you? Log cabins, that represents, you know, the American frontier, the hard-working American. Hard cider, well, they're not drinking foo-foo drinks like wine, they're drinking hard cider. These are real men. Harrison's a real man. We are real men. And so the Whigs take what's meant to be an insult, they turn it around and make it into a positive. This is an untitled song, which is to the tune of Rockabye Baby. So again, in your mind, you can sort of go with the tune as you read the lyrics.
One version went, Rockabye baby, daddy's a Whig. When he comes home, hard cider he'll swig. And when he has swug, he'll fall in a stew. And down will come Tyler and tip a canoe.
And this is a Democratic song that is used to attack the Whigs for drinking hard cider. And so what happens when you drink hard cider? Well, sometimes you probably get drunk. Many times you probably get drunk. And so this is a way to remind voters that, you know, the Whigs are saying that log cabin, hard cider candidate, that's a great thing, but what they're really saying is that, you know, we're going to get drunk. And in an era in which the Second Great Awakening is taking place, and I know the Polk home has a new exhibit on religion during this era that you probably should go check out. But in the context of the religious revival that's taking place, this could have been problematic for the Whigs. Now what's interesting is that the Whigs, they focus on hard cider as being about true Americanism, and then they focus on Harrison. They present him as someone who is a devout Christian. So there are biographies written of him and accounts shared in newspapers of him. The first thing he does when he gets up is he falls on his knees and he prays. And, you know, when he was actually fighting Native Americans, you know, he prayed to God to know what to do, you know, with these savage people. So there's this religious hue that's added to sort of offset, I think, the way that the Democrats try to use a hard cider description of the Whigs in a negative way.
At this point, Dr. Cheathem had explained that political songs, public speeches, and partisan newspapers were all affecting the campaign of 1840. But he had also mentioned print culture, such as political lithographs and cartoons. So why was all this happening? What changes made all this possible? I asked the President James K. Polk Home and Museum curator Candace Candido to help shed some light.
So the time period that we're talking about here, basically right around and leading up to the election of 1840, a lot of different forces came together to facilitate this sort of coming of age of American print culture. So the lithograph had been invented in Europe in 1796, but it took a while to get going in the United States. And during this period, the technology was developed and improved to make it even faster and more efficient to produce these prints. And at the same time, you also have really high literacy rates, higher than they've ever been, as well as improvements to infrastructure, so much better roads, and developments to the national postal system that made it possible to get these materials into the hands of more people and more potential voters. And so all these forces combined contributed to the high number of these types of political lithographs that we see from this period, and to the impact that these images could have on the political process.
This is one of my favorites from the 40 campaign. This is William Henry Harrison at his home, and he's being visited by Martin Van Buren and other Democrats. What's really fascinating about the 1840 campaign is that the Whigs depict Harrison as just an average American, a hard-working farmer. And in this case, he is dressed just like a farmer, out in the fields, tilling the ground. Well, what's interesting about Harrison's background is that he comes from a very wealthy, aristocratic Virginia family. And his home is a mansion. The Whigs ignore all that. They depict him, again, as just an average, common American. And the Whigs depict Martin Van Buren as an elite, aristocratic, wealthy, out-of-touch president, when in fact Van Buren came from a family in which his father was a tavern keeper in upstate New York. He does not come from means. He does not come from wealth. So you have these two contrasting depictions of candidates by the opposing parties. And it doesn't matter what the Democrats say about Harrison, their criticism of Harrison doesn't seem to catch on. The Whigs' criticism of Van Buren, however, which is mostly inaccurate, does catch on. And what's interesting about that, and you may be wondering, well, why is that? Well, part of it is just that the Whigs are better at campaigning at this point. They have figured out how to use cultural politics to their advantage in ways that the Democrats had not. The other thing that makes the Whigs' criticism effective is that Van Buren, during his presidency, oversaw the most dramatic, most consequential financial depression the United States had ever seen. The United States economy goes in the tank in 1837, recovers, then goes in the tank again in 1839. And so you have a president who's overseeing an economy who doesn't do much to help the economy, because at that point, that's not something presidents did. Presidents didn't actively intervene and try to help when it came to that sort of thing. And so even though Van Buren doesn't actively intervene, he's still blamed for what's happening economically. And so the Whigs use that to their advantage. And so if you're an average voter and you're living, maybe you're homeless, maybe you're hungry, maybe you lost your job, and you're trying to figure out, who do I vote for? You're going to be attracted to the Whigs' message that, who caused all your problems? It was Martin Van Buren. Why? He's living it up in the White House. He has a British carriage. He has to have the finest clothes. He has to have gold spoons at dinner. He has to have all these things. And so you need to vote for, again, the log cabin and hard cider, true American candidate, William Henry Harrison, even though that depiction of Harrison doesn't really match with reality when you look at his socioeconomic status. So in any case, you have Harrison here meeting these Democratic leaders, and he again is tilling the farm, the field by himself, which he would not have done. And these Democrats are talking about, how are we going to be able to beat this guy? How in the world can we get voters to vote for us when he is a true American?
The Whigs in 1840 were able to use the new tools of presidential campaigning more effectively than the Democrats. And they branded Harrison not as an elite, but as one of the electorate. They realized that maybe the truth of a candidate was not as important as the image of a candidate. Dr. Cheathem demonstrates that 1840 is in a lot of ways the first modern presidential campaign, and many parts of that political playbook are in use to this day, nearly 180 years later.
What does all this tell us about that time and about today? So many of you probably remember in the 1960s, that there were politically charged songs that came out. You have songs by Creedence Clearwater Revival, you have songs by the Monkees, you have songs by a number of different artists that were used to protest what was going on during the Vietnam era. And if you fast forward to more recently, and you may not be as familiar with these as maybe some of my students are, but groups like Green Day, artists like Pink, some of the rappers who are artists today, many of them have very political songs that they use to critique society. And even though it's a different type of music and the lyrics are different and they're probably more vulgar and that sort of thing, it's the same principle. The principle is, how can we condense into an easily remembered form a political message that we want to convey to people? That's what they were doing in the Jacksonian period, and that's what happens today. And then when it comes to political cartoons, we still have political cartoons. If you take a newspaper, you know that on the editorial page, you'll probably see a cartoon. They're probably not as interesting as they were back then, but in social media today, there are these things called memes. But essentially, you will take, say, a still image from a movie or from a TV show or from pop culture of some sort, and you will superimpose text on it, some sort of writing on it, that may be from that TV show or movie or may not, but it's used to convey a message. And during the 2016 campaign in particular, memes were used by both Democrats and Republicans to criticize the opposition party. Again, it's not political cartoons per se, but it's a similar idea. How can we, in a visual image, send a political message that will be easily remembered, that can be deconstructed and remembered? And so, again, even though in the 21st century things are very, very different than they were during the Jacksonian period, I think you can see the origins of many of the things that we have politically when it comes to presidential campaigning emerged during that period and remain in some form with us today.
A song we don't object to sing, but Uncle Sam is now the thing. He cries for Polk and Dallas go and save Texas from Mexico. Weeks clear the way, weeks give way till freedom backs us. Weeks give way for Polk and Dallas and young Texas. Sly Harry and Theodore so grand, instead of gaining some more land, they'll sell each acre to the foe and sell the people on it too. Weeks give way till freedom backs us. Weeks give way for Polk and Dallas and young Texas.
This has been Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. For more information, visit www.jameskpolk.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.